Recording is on. I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. Today is Sunday, April 5th, 2020, and I had intended to talk about the next phase in our economic crisis, which is the collapse of U.S. federal debt and the U.S. dollar. As bad as things seem right now, they're going to get far worse as the U.S. government becomes more and more insolvent. But I'm not going to talk about that in this episode. I'm saving federal debt for the next episode in a couple of days. This episode is a personal one with not a lot of economics or demography in it. This is a sort of personal oral history of where were you during the shutdown. Everyone has their story about how they spent these days when the government ordered them to stay inside. And mine is a little exotic and not what you expect. For the past 13 days, I've been weathering the apocalypse in a very comfortable cancer ward in Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. It's a place I know very well because I was treated here in 2018 successfully for lymphoma, blood cancer. I lived over a year without cancer, and now it's come back. Now, if you look at the video version of this podcast, you will see some video of my doing this podcast to give you a perspective on where I am. I am a very spacious private room with a nice view of Boston, 7th floor view of Boston, all the amenities I could possibly want, a very comfortable seat to sit in while I work on my computer projects, unlimited free Wi-Fi, unlimited all-you-can-eat food from a pretty good menu. If ever I want anything, I just press a button. I just press a button here and people come rushing to serve my every needs. If I want ice, they bring me ice. If anything else I could possibly want. It's like the best 5-star hotel. This is in fact a $700 a night hotel. And there's no place I'd rather be during the apocalypse. I can't think of any place that's more comfortable. So I'm recording this in my hospital gown, which is my chosen attire. I could wear my street clothes because I'm not all that sick. In fact, on the surface, I'm not sick at all. This is more of a technical cancer. We know there are cancer cells floating around in my body, but on the surface, I'm healthy as a horse. The cancer I have is called lymphoma. It's a cancer of the blood. It distributes itself all over the body. So it's not something you can have any surgery for. The only way to address it is chemotherapy. And I'm going to talk about that in this podcast. So in this podcast, I want to talk about my own condition because I just love talking about my own condition. I know all the intricacies of lymphoma and the unique characteristics of my particular case. And I could go on and on and on for hours about lymphoma because I think it's cool. I mean, the almost dying part is not cool. And that the almost dying part actually happened to me a couple of times in July 2018 and 2 weeks ago. But as long as I'm going to live, I'm going to enjoy myself. And this is really a wonderful place where I have real friends. I love the staff here, and we know each other very well because I spent 79 days in here in 2018. So it's a wonderful place. I could talk for hours about it, but I'm just going to give you the highlights of what this cancer is and how it works. And then I'm going to talk about COVID-19 because I'm in a special place. I'm right in the smack dab in a big city hospital in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic. And you may wonder, how is the hospital holding up? How are people here? Are people here going stir crazy? Is the tension so high that no one can function? Is the disease sweeping through the wards? And the answer to most of that stuff is no. Everyone's holding up pretty well, and there's no great tension. It's extremely calm in the hospital right now. And the main reason for that is there are no visitors. So you just, in a cancer ward like this, you used to have one patient in a room plus about 3 or 4 family members who are all there to give their, quote, support. And that became a burden. That's a burden to the staff, because not only does the staff have to manage the patient, they have to manage the family members. And one of the great perks of COVID-19 is they've cut out absolutely all visitors from the hospital. You either are a patient or you're a staff member. You've got to be vetted. You've got to be screened before you come in. No visitors are allowed. I think the only exception would be the maternity ward. Someone giving birth is allowed to have one person with them. So what my own treatment consists of, in summary, is that I probably have 4 months of chemotherapy ahead of me. For the most part, it's going to be low impact chemotherapy that really won't impinge on my computing skills or the sort of activities I normally do, which is mainly computer based. For about 2.5 months is a phase of relatively low impact conventional chemotherapy, which in 2-week cycles, where I spend about 4 days in the hospital and then 10 days out of the hospital. And that could be followed by 30 days in isolation, where they put me in a room very much like this one. It could actually be this room. They never let me out for 30 days. They completely kill my bone marrow and my immune system, and they reconstruct it from my own blood later. So they're doing a complete reboot of my immune system, which hopefully would be an immune system without the cancer. It's worth a shot. It may not be a permanent solution, but at this stage, I'm grateful for any extra innings they give me. I should have bought the farm back in July 2018. I didn't. I could have bought the farm 2 weeks ago. I didn't. So I'm really grateful to the medical world for giving me more time, and I intend to use it for the things that are most important to me, which happens to be this podcast right now and this Demographic Doom project. So to put this moment into historical perspective, we are now in the lockdown phase of the coronavirus epidemic, where most U.S. states and European countries have ordered non-essential businesses to close and asked those workers to stay home. Schools, offices, and most stores are closed. The only stores that are open are for essential things like food and gasoline and, of course, alcohol. You can't get through any crisis without alcohol. So, at least in Massachusetts, liquor stores are still open. Otherwise, the economy has all but stopped. And I know this is devastating. I know that this is, in the long run, this is going to cause far more human suffering than the virus itself, because you can't just turn off an economy and then turn it back on again. It's like you can't turn off the glue factory and let it sit for 3 months and then just start it back up again, because all the glue is already set in place. So I'm looking out on the streets around me. It's strangely quiet out there. This is a main drag in front of my room called Brookline Avenue. It is usually packed with traffic. Even on a Sunday, it's packed with traffic. And I can look out there and I see no cars. Maybe one car every 3 or 4 minutes. And it's really spooky. And that's the only indication I have that anything's wrong in the outside world. I never had an opportunity to directly experience the lockdown phase, because I came into the hospital on March 23rd, which is just about the time that states like New York and Massachusetts were implementing their lockdowns. So all the information I have from the outside world comes from looking out at the street and from the media, which of course is recording all of this, but there's so much damn news. There's so many things happening at once and so many crises going on at once that the media is almost just noise. It's really hard to pick out what's important, what isn't in the media. So for the most part, I've been tuning it out. I scan through the news stories as I usually do. I put some of them in my my Twitter feed. I'm very active on the Demographic Doom Twitter feed in preserving articles that I think are important to the moment, to demography and to economics. I'm posting key articles there, but I'm not posting a lot because there's so much noise now that it's hard to pick out the things that really matter. So I want to give you a brief history of how I got here. Roughly 2.5 weeks ago, everything was hunky-dory. I had spent all of 2019 cancer-free. I entered 2019 very weak, physically weak, kind of hobbling along because of all the effects of some really heavy-duty chemotherapy that I went through in 2018. By the end of the year, December 2019, I was in full health. There was virtually nothing wrong with me. I had fully recovered. And this lasted through mid-March when I began to experience some new symptoms. And it was around March 20th that I first began to experience some fatigue doing normal activities. And because I wear a Fitbit, I noticed that my heart rate was going way up. So let's say on a certain date, March 15th, I had a normal heart rate, which is a low of 56 beats per minute and a high of 102 beats per minute, doing just routine things, which is the heartbeat profile of a very young man. By around the 19th or 20th of March, I was experiencing this fatigue, elevated heart rate, some difficulty breathing, a sense that my lungs weren't filling up as well as they could. And what was my first diagnosis? What would be your first diagnosis in that situation? Well, I figured I must have COVID-19. I've been very careful about COVID-19. I was tuned into it long before most other people were. I have my own protocol for how I touch things and how I use hand sanitizer and stuff. So I would have been surprised if I had COVID-19, but at the early stages, it has such vague symptoms that maybe I had it. So for about 24 hours, I thought, well, maybe I have COVID-19. But it really didn't fit the profile. It didn't progress in that way. I had none of the, apart from elevated heart rate and fatigue, I really had none of the symptoms. My next self-diagnosis was altitude sickness because I was at a high altitude in New Mexico and Arizona, 6,000 feet. I thought, well, I'm really not used to this. I must be gasping for breath. Then I went down to a lower altitude, Phoenix, about 1,000 feet, and the symptoms persisted. So then I finally settled on my third diagnosis, which was some form of anemia caused by a relapse of my cancer. And that turned out to be more or less correct, except for the anemia part. I did not suffer low blood counts. I had always had plenty of red blood cells. What was happening to me is totally unexpected. I had fluid building up around my heart. So there is this pericardium, which is a sac around the heart that usually it doesn't have anything in it, just a little bit of liquid. And this was filling up over the course of many days. And as it filled up, it was suppressing the activity of the heart. And the heart had to beat much harder to get even the most rudimentary blood through. I didn't know this at the time. All I knew around the 20th of March is that it's about time to hightail it back to my home hospital back in Boston. And it took me a while to get there because I had some hoops to jump through. I'm in Arizona. I have to get to Boston. There's certain things I have to do to get there. I was in touch with my medical staff, and they weren't terribly alarmed. But they definitely want me to get in fast. So I guess the low point of my situation was Sunday, I think the 22nd of March. I was quite weak. I was driving like a bat out of hell from Virginia up toward Boston because I knew I needed to check into my hospital to get the best treatment. It would do me no good to check into some other emergency room where I would just need to be transferred to my hospital. So on early on Sunday, the 20th, I called my page, the emergency number, the secret number I have for my doctors. They advised me to come in the next day, which was good by me. So that was the morning of Sunday. And in the evening of Sunday, about 10 p.m., I fainted. So I was doing just fine the whole time while sitting in a car and driving. I was fully alert. I was capable of making decisions and driving safely. But once I got up and started walking around, I was in danger. I was very weak, and I fainted just walking from the car to a restroom in a rest area in Virginia. I fainted twice, and I could feel myself going down. It wasn't dangerous. Fainting is not like a seizure. A seizure happens suddenly, but fainting, you got a few seconds warning. You can protect yourself. So I felt myself going down. I got up again. I walked a little bit further toward the restroom. I felt myself going down, and I got to the restroom and managed to stumble back by going from one object to the next to get back into my car. So that's 10 p.m. on Sunday night. I know I got to get to the emergency room in my hospital. The only way to do it is to drive straight through. So I was in good enough shape that I drove straight through from Virginia to Boston. And when the morning came, I emailed my doctor's office. They said, go to the emergency room. And about 1 p.m., I got to the emergency room in the hospital. As I will talk about later, there was no huge crush of COVID patients. Sure, what's up? You can just put it on my, why don't you put it on the chair right here? Just there, and I'll take care of it. Great. Thank you very much. Is that Shirley Danger? Yes. Hi, Shirley Danger. Okay, I'm recording my podcast now. Okay. See ya. So I stumble into the emergency department at 1 p.m. on a Monday. There's no huge crush of COVID patients. I do not have the symptoms of COVID, so they basically waved me right through to the emergency department, and I didn't have to wait even a minute to be seen. And within an hour, they had diagnosed my problem. It was not anemia. They did an echocardiogram of my heart, and they saw that this big sack of fluid was all around my heart. So they put me in the cardiac ICU. They didn't think it was urgent enough to drain the heart right away, so I spent a very rather difficult night in the cardiac ECU, hooked up to all the wires and the tubes and things. And then the next day, which would have been the 24th of March, they actually inserted a catheter into my chest to drain the fluid from around the heart. And I absolutely love this stuff. They use a local anesthesia when they put the tube in, but they don't. And most people take a sedative, so they're not really looking at it. But I refuse the sedative. I want to be there for this whole thing as they're sticking it in. I think that's cool to experience the whole thing. If I could do open heart surgery and remain conscious for it, I would want to do it because I think all this stuff is cool. Anyway, they stuck this tube in me. They drained about 1 liter of fluid from around my heart. It looked to me like blood, and for about 24 hours, I held on to that delusion that this was just blood, that there had just been some bleeding in the pericardium, and that now that they've drained the blood away, everything's going to just be hunky-dory. That was shattered the next day when I learned that there are cancer cells in that fluid, and that probably the cancer cells were the cause of the bleeding in some way, that cancer cells tend to build fragile blood systems, which can easily bleed. So it was never really clear why I got all that fluid all at once in a very quick way. But clearly there was cancer there, and that cancer had to be addressed. So I spent about 2 days, 48 hours in the ICU, the cardiac ICU. I was in lockdown myself because they were screening me for COVID-19. Even though I didn't have any symptoms, the fact that I had traveled a lot and was enough for them to screen me for it. And that's not just for my own protection, but they're going to stick me into a ward, a cancer ward with a lot of immunocompromised people. And you want to make sure that you're filtering everybody that goes in here. So for 48 hours, I was in lockdown in the cardiac ICU. That meant that I couldn't leave the room. Everyone who visited me, I couldn't leave the room because I had so many wires attached to me, but I couldn't leave the room otherwise. Every staff member who visited me had to be in the full gowns and masks and visors and gloves to interact with me. And that lasted for 48 hours while they cleared me of COVID. So unlike many of you, I have actually been cleared of COVID. I've been tested for COVID-19 at this point 4 times, and they've come out negative every time. So I have that advantage. And I think that in the hospital, you've heard of COVID being distributed in the hospital, but things are so compartmentalized in the hospital that it's extremely unlikely of getting it here. Because they're so cautious with just about everything, about who comes into the ward and making sure that everybody is cleared before they come in. So during those 2 days in the cardiac ICU, the first day was draining the liquid, the 1 liter of liquid from the heart. I almost immediately, all my symptoms vanished. Suddenly, I felt great. My heart was beating normally. There were a lot of kidney and liver functions that had to get back to normal. But essentially, as of day 3 of my incarceration here, I've been healthy as a horse. I'm healthy as a horse right now, at least outwardly. And we're only dealing with this technical cancer. Now, on my first day, I got my heart drained. It continued to drip into a pouch at my side. I continued to be hooked up with all of the wires. And that's the day I recorded my first in-hospital. And the day after that, the drainage, I recorded my first in-hospital podcast. So that's dedication for you. And it's double dedication because I was in a very noisy room with a very noisy circulation system. And I had to mitigate that by building myself a sound studio. You could see photos of it on Instagram. I set up, I put myself under a tent. I set up a superstructure with my computer and my microphones and everything, and had the nurses drape me with a tent so I could record this podcast. So I'm very proud to have cranked that out right there in the cardiac ICU while I have all these tubes and wires coming out of me. So things are way better right now. I don't have it. All I've got right now is an IV. So they cleared me of COVID-19. They opened up the doors. Now people can interact with me in their normal way, which in the hospital right now, everyone is wearing a mask. Absolutely everyone. All the staff members are wearing masks. I don't have to wear a mask in my room, but I do have to wear a mask if I ever step out of my room. Masks are in short supply. Every staff member is issued 1 per day. They have to make it last 1 per day. And in my 13 days stay, I've had only 2 masks, so I've been a very good boy. So they moved me up to my favorite place, which is Feldberg 7. It is my own hospital ward. It has a very stable staff. I know everybody here. They know me. They know my quirks. They know that I'm a platinum level customer. So I'm a frequent flyer here. Having spent 79 days here, I've achieved platinum frequent flyer status, which means I keep reminding the staff of this, that this means that I get a little special service whenever that's available. I get access to a special menu, a secret menu that most guests don't have. And I expect, service commensurate with my platinum status. So it's fun. It's really a blast. I would never, I'm one of the few people who really, really loves it here and really, really dreads it when they try to kick me out, because I'm doing everything I want to do, working on my computer. I don't have any obligations apart from just, peeing in a cup every now and then. They're very nice to me. I don't abuse them much, and we get along very famously. It's the only place where I have real physical friends. So outside in the real world, I am a virtual entity. I have virtual friends on Facebook. I do not have physical friends who I actually see, except right here in this ward. And there's a little bit of barriers between us because, as I say, everyone's wearing masks. But I actually physically interact with everybody. I get along great with my doctors. I ask the smart questions. I know as much as they do about a lot of this stuff. So I feel that I'm in my element. I'm in a position of flow where everything works just right. And I'm not very sick. I've been healthy as a horse for at least 10 days now. And at least in the first phase of chemotherapy, I expect that to more or less last. There will be some weakness, some issues, but more or less I should be able to function as normal. So they brought me back to my favorite ward and started running tests. And the reason that I'm basically for 10 days, they ran tests and determined what they're going to do about this. The tests, for the most part, all turned up negative. So we definitely have cancer cells in the pericardium. This is lymphoma, a certain kind of blood cell that has gone haywire and divided without permission. It's called a B cell. And those cells exist in my pericardium. But there's no evidence of cancer anywhere else in my body. So they did a PET scan, head to toe, looking for tumors, not a single visible tumor. They took my head off and put it into an MRI machine and scanned it with the MRI machine and put it back on again. No visible cancer in the head. They took spinal fluid, no cancer in the spinal fluid. So as far as we know, the cancer is only in the pericardium. But with this kind of cancer, is almost certainly elsewhere. It's a blood cancer. It can float all over the body. It needs to be addressed, because if it's not addressed, I'll be dead in a fair amount of time. Something else will happen. I'll be dead in a fair amount of time. So we're addressing it. I got this 10 days of glory when I didn't even have an IV hooked up to me. And for 3 of those days, I put in 10,000 steps on my Fitbit. That's how healthy I was. 3 nights in a row. No outward sign. I call myself a malingerer in that I'm a person occupying a hospital bed who isn't really sick. And I'm quick to tell anybody I'm not sick. I don't belong here, but they've got the numbers. They've got the things they have to do, and that convinces them that they need to keep me here to line everything up. So it was only yesterday that a treatment plan was approved and began. And as I mentioned before, this involves about 2.5 months of low impact chemotherapy. Normally it is in 2-week cycles where where I spend 4 days in the hospital and 10 days out of the hospital. But in practice, it ends up being a lot more time in the hospital because there end up being complications. Might have some pneumonia or something else that shows up in the test, and I end up spending more than the 4 days in the hospital, which is just fine by me. I don't relish the idea of going out there into the real world where there's no one to care for me and no button I can push to make everything right. So that's 2.5 months, and will probably, if that phase is successful, be followed by a autologous stem cell transplant, which is when they completely reboot my immune system. So they put me in a room for 30 days. I cannot leave. They take my blood and distill from my own blood certain stem cells, certain kind of basic cells that are the building blocks for all the other cells. And they take those cells, which look like blood, and they're going to put them in the fridge. I imagine it's a pretty high-tech fridge because I don't want anybody tripping over the cord of the fridge, or I'll be a dead duck. So they take my own stem cells, and then they hit me with a really high-strength, heavy-duty chemotherapy, scorched earth chemotherapy that kills everything that moves. Always the aim of chemotherapy is always to stop cell division. Many of the cells in the body do not divide, and that includes brain cells and muscle cells and heart cells. But the cells that do divide are going to be killed by this heavy-duty chemotherapy, and including all of my bone marrow. My bone marrow will be wiped out, and the bone marrow is the source of all my blood cells, my white blood cells and my red blood cells. There will be a period in which I am a boy in a bubble, entirely vulnerable to any kind of infection. And then they will, when they've killed everything, killed all my blood, they will give me back my own stem cells, which apparently know what to do. You stick my stem cells back into my bloodstream, and they automatically migrate to the bone marrow and start repopulating my system so that I can make red blood cells and white blood cells again. So it sounds scary. I don't think I think the risk of mortality is pretty low. They've done a lot of these things. The main risk is that during my low period, I'm vulnerable to some kind of infection, opportunistic infection, and that's why I live in a bubble. I get a cut in the wrong way, and something gets in there, it could be potentially fatal. But all in all, these procedures themselves are pretty safe and with a low mortality. Now, in the long run, my chances of mortality are pretty darn near 100%. And that's because we all die. We all die sometime before the age of 100. And I'm getting ready for that. But in terms of short to medium term mortality, I don't think it's all that different than yours. Pretty good chance I have a year or two guaranteed, and everything else is dependent on how successful this treatment is. So I go through the 30 days. I have a good time because I always enjoy being here. I can't go out, but my friends and the staff can come in. I have a big recliner here that the staff can sit in and come and set a spell. I'm so well known that I can still, exert my personality as needed to get the things I want, and I'm doing what I love to do, which is working on my computer and recording podcasts. At the end of 30 days, I'm let back when they're certain that my system is back online. They let me out, and there's a recovery period of an unknown period of time, and then I'm out in the world again, and hopefully I get another year or two of being cancer-free. The best case scenario is I'm cancer-free forever, but that's a lot to shoot for with this kind of cancer. These are soft cancers. Hard cancers are like lung cancer or actual hard tumors. They can be cut out, and once they're cut out, there's a very good chance that they won't be back. But with soft cancers like blood cancers, there is a high chance of relapse. So you just do what you can. You try one thing, it gives me another couple of years. If that doesn't work, you try something else. I'm concerned in the long run that 2 or 3 years from now, the medical system and the economy might not be functional anymore, may not be able to save me like it used to. But that's for the future. I only need to have confidence right now that the system is going to last for the 4 months of my treatment. I think that we can probably pull that off. So the name of my current treatment regimen, the one they just started yesterday, is methotrexate. Like other chemotherapy, it stops cell division, which has certain characteristic effects. It means your blood counts fall. A blood cell lives for about 5 days. So it's not going to kill existing blood cells, but it's going to kill the ability of the bone marrow to create blood cells. And I may need transfusions of other people's blood. This is not your grandfather's chemotherapy. Your grandfather's chemotherapy just killed everything and everything that divides and made the patient miserable. This is pretty targeted. Methotrexate is strong stuff, which stops cell division of all kinds. But then they come up with a mitigating chemical called leucovorin, which restarts some of the more normal cell division. So hopefully I can still have blood cells dividing normally, even as the methotrexate interferes in the division of the cancer cells. So in terms of what I went through before in 2018, they really hit me with the heavy stuff, because I was so far gone. When I came into the hospital in 2018, I had tumors everywhere in my body. July 2018, you look at a PET scan and there were tumors head to toe everywhere, in my brain, in my chest, in my legs, everywhere. And they really had to take some extreme measures to save my life, including the toughest chemo they had. It was successful in that 2 months later, you did the same PET scan, and there were no tumors visible. So in the space of 2 months, we got what's called a complete response of entirely killing the visible cancer in my body. Of course, they couldn't stop there, because even if there's no visible cancer, there's going to be errant cancer cells floating around. So they kept going for another 3 months. 2 months to destroy all the cancer, and then another 3 months of mop-up operations. And by the end of the year, I was officially declared in remission. And then I had that wonderful year, 2019, without any cancer at all. And in comparison to that, methotrexate, I expect to be extremely mild with very little effects. There's always an opportunity for opportunistic infection, but I don't expect the same weakness and immunovulnerability that I had the last time around, and that I could probably engage in most activities. But we'll see what happens. If phase 1 is successful, that methotrexate treatment, then I immediately start phase 2, which is the complete reboot of the immune system, and I'm really looking forward to that. I'm going to be in a room just like this one with all the amenities. I can still eat things. They just have to be cooked things. I can't have any fresh fruits or vegetables. Everything I have has to be cooked. And otherwise, it's pretty much the life I have now. I just won't be able to walk the halls like I normally do, and can't put steps on my Fitbit, but 30 days is nothing. My only regret in spending 30 days in isolation is they're going to have to kick me out after 30 days. And maybe, given the state of the world, maybe I just won't want that to happen. Now, I always have reason to worry. I have financial concerns. Insurance is paying nearly all of it, but there is portions that I must pay, and I need to keep myself financially afloat in this difficult time. This is a challenge, but that challenge is no different than everyone else's. Everyone else's life is highly uncertain right now. At least I know physically where I'm going to be. I'm physically going to either be in the hospital or released for a few days on bail right here in the Boston area. And I face the same challenges of everyone else of how to reconstruct my life in the new post-COVID era. From a medical standpoint, I just need the medical system to remain functional for the next 4 months, enough to get me through my therapy. And from what I see now, I think it will remain functional for the next 4 months. Things are operating pretty well from my standpoint, in spite of the COVID crisis. And I want to talk about the COVID crisis and how it's affecting the hospital here. The hospital is a very compartmentalized place. Everyone has their very small job to do. The ward that they serve, the tests that they do, And they're not seeing any great tension. They're continuing to do their jobs. MRI technicians are continuing to do MRIs, and nurses are in the cancer ward are continuing to care for cancer patients just as they normally do. There are only a couple of differences between today and what I experienced in 2018. I mentioned that there's no visitors. That's a huge boon to the staff. It's a boon to me. There are no shared rooms. You don't have to share a room with anyone anymore. Everyone gets their own private room, which I love. I adore the staff here, but I'm not so keen on the patients. The patients are kind of drab, more or less. I wish, for the most part, I don't have to deal with them. They're behind closed doors. They're watching TV. They're sitting like zombies in their beds watching TV. There aren't a lot of people who use laptops. There aren't a lot of young people. I'm probably in the lower age range of the people here. A lot of people are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and cancer is just the thing that's going to take them out. Everyone dies of something, and for many it is cancer, but the staff puts in a Herculean effort to try to save everybody, regardless of their age. It's kind of strange. So whether you're a 20-year-old with cancer or an 80-year-old with cancer, the system is going to put the same resources into you, regardless of your condition or your prospects. And I've talked about that in other podcasts. This is one great defect of the medical system that we know is that it cannot distinguish worthy cases from unworthy cases. It cannot conduct triage, deciding who to save and not to save. And I see that right here in the cancer ward. They put the same amount of effort into someone who's about to die anyway as they would put into someone who has their whole life ahead of them. So there's no visitors, 100% private rooms. All of the staff are wearing masks. Everyone is wearing a mask right now, even outside of my room. So at times when I can walk around in the ward, everyone is wearing a mask, and I have to learn to identify them from the top of their head. And I do, because I know all these people pretty well. I can tell from the top of, and it's actually an advantage because I can guess someone's identity. And if I get it wrong, I don't lose any points because it's hard to tell when you only see the top of people's heads and they change outfits. Recently, within the past 3 or 4 days, they've started instituting a policy where every patient room is treated as a special droplet zone where the staff has to be in full garb when they come in. They have to be in a mask and a gown and face protection, eye protection, and gloves. So they have plenty of all of that stuff except masks. So masks are still in short supply, but they have plenty of everything else. And I assume that the mask issue will be resolved pretty quickly. I think American industry should be able to resolve the mask crisis. In all, I don't really sense a lot of tension in the ward. You think, oh, it must be terrible to work in a hospital right now. No, they're annoyances. The mask restrictions, all the COVID-19 precautions, they're an annoyance. A memo comes out, we're going to do things differently. Okay, the staff does things differently. It's just an annoyance. It doesn't interfere in their doing of their jobs. And it's way outweighed by the fact that you don't have to deal with visitors anymore. So the COVID restrictions are annoying, but not having to have any visitors is a joy. At least I would see it as a joy in that staff doesn't have to manage visitors anymore. They also don't have to manage volunteers. So if you got a cancer ward, there are all sorts of volunteers from the community who want to come in and, quote, help raise the spirits of the cancer patients, which in my mind is more trouble than it's worth. For example, they have Reiki practitioners. They had Reiki practitioners in 2018, and where they would come in and use some sort of energy field to invigorate you. They place their hands over certain parts of your body and evoke good energies. And I did this once. It was relaxing in the sense that I had to lay still for 15 minutes. But I didn't really feel the energy, It's kind of anti-medical to talk about that stuff. It's just a placebo effect. And I had much better things to do with 15 minutes. So I did the Reiki once and said, okay, that's good enough. I enjoyed that. That's fine. And they kept coming back. Every time I got readmitted to the hospital, they would come back and wanted to give it to me again. I said, no, we don't need that anymore. And all of that kind of adds to the noise, unnecessary noise level of the ward. Now that all that noise is cut out, you're 100% concentrated on the patient and solving the patient's medical issues. And it makes life in the ward all so much easier. So that's all I see from my standpoint. It's the same people, the same workload, maybe a little easier on the staff because of the lack of visitors, but pretty much life as normal. What is it like in the ER? I mean, this is a big city hospital. It has its emergency room. It's actually at a separate location from where I am. It's a couple blocks away. Is it chaos down there? Is it pandemonium at the emergency room? And my only experience is when I came into the emergency room on March 23rd, there was no pandemonium. I was kind of worried about coming into the ED or the emergency department because I thought, well, it's going to be slammed. I won't get through. I had no trouble getting through. And what they do is they set up this desk essentially facing the street. And they ask you a bunch of questions. And if you have the symptoms of COVID-19, but you are not in respiratory distress, they tell you to go home right then and there. We don't want you here. Go home. Go home and self-isolate. They'll only take you if you are in respiratory distress, and presumably they have a separate channel for you. They're going to go off in a certain direction, a certain set of wards that are only for COVID-19. And they're rapidly rearranging their resources to have these sections just for COVID-19. And the way they do that is they're canceling all forms of elective surgery. There's no more hip replacements, no more sports injury stuff. Anything that's non-essential is going to be put aside for now, which gives them all these extra beds that they can use for COVID-19. So you come up into this main desk right on the street. They screen you right away. Do you have COVID-19? If you do, go home. If you're in respiratory distress, you're going to go down that hallway. If you have none of the above, then you're going to go into the regular emergency room, which was my condition. I had orders from my doctor to go there, and I had none of the symptoms of COVID-19. So once I went into the regular emergency room, there were no lines, no waiting. I was seen immediately, and it was extremely calm. And that's kind of how they divide things up. So the normal ED does what it normally does, and then you have a whole separate system for COVID-19. So they diagnosed me within half an hour. They knew what was wrong. They did a portable echocardiogram, saw the fluid, and knew what they needed to do. It was incredible customer service. You can gripe about medical system in the U.S. And how screwed up it is financially and in many other ways. But in terms of service, I don't think I could get the same fast service anywhere else in the world. I've had to wait in emergency rooms in Europe. I once waited for 6 hours in an emergency room in Cyprus. It only cost me 10 euros, but I had to wait for 6 hours. In America, you never have to wait. If there's a test, you go into the emergency room, literally you get seen in a matter of minutes. If there's a test that needs to be done, it happens that day. There are no delays. So that's one really great thing about the American medical system. It's all very focused on customer service. All the hospitals are competing with each other. So there is a high quality of service. I'm very impressed by the quality of service in America, even if the financial underpinnings of it are all screwed up. So I never saw a COVID patient at the ED. There was nobody waiting in line, no one dying on the streets or anything like that. I don't know what happens to the COVID patients exactly, but my presumption is that they're going into their own separate system, that we have floors and wards that are only going to be COVID patients. We're going to continue to treat them as we would normally, which is one person per room. We're going to give them all optimal care. Every patient that comes in is going to get optimal care. But there has to be a limit. There's at some point they're going to fill up their capacity, and all that they can do is refuse people. They say, okay, you have respiratory distress, but we don't have any facilities for you, and somebody else has to deal with it. It's a very messy thing once a hospital reaches capacity, but all the messiness is out on the streets. If the Beth Israel were to reach its COVID capacity, it would simply not take in any more ambulances. It wouldn't accept any more ambulances, and those ambulances would have to go someplace else. And it's up to the city of Boston to try to figure out what to do with these people. And that's where you get into the ad hoc field hospitals. Maybe you turn a convention center into a field hospital. That's a whole separate thing that doesn't really involve the hospital. The hospital is all about giving optimal care to everyone who comes in, and they're going to continue to do it. They're going to give you the best care possible while in the hospital. It's just a matter of whether you're going to get into the hospital at all to receive that care. So there's a conflict in medicine that I've touched on previous podcasts and videos. And that's the difference between best practices medicine and triage medicine. Now, best practices medicine is when you pull out all the stops to save one patient. You want to give him the best of everything, and you try not to expose him to any kind of risk. And that's how medicine is practiced in the developed world. Whatever it is, whatever risk there is, we're going to mitigate it. Whatever the patient needs, we're going to give it to them. We're not going to compromise on anything. And this is actually backed up by our tort legal system in America, our system of lawsuits. If ever a doctor were to give a patient less than optimal care and something bad were to happen, the patient or their family is going to sue that doctor. That's how America works. So America really has no choice. American hospitals have no choice but to offer optimal care, best practices care to everyone. Now, the alternative to that would be triage medicine. Triage medicine is when you don't have the resources available to treat everyone. And this is true in about well over half the world. They don't have the medical systems to treat everyone. So they have to parcel out their resources in such a way as to save the maximum number of people. This is the sort of thing that would happen on a battlefield. Let's say you have a battlefield hospital, and you have 100 wounded soldiers that come in, and you've got beds for only a dozen of them. Who are you going to serve, and how are you going to serve them? That's an exercise in triage, in deciding how to parcel out your very inadequate resources. In the case of a wartime hospital, you're going to focus on the patients that you could do the most for. In other words, there's soldiers that come in that are so badly wounded that you can't do anything for them. They're probably going to die anyway, so you shunt them aside to begin with. And then there are soldiers who are so lightly wounded that they're going to survive no matter what you do for them, and they can get away for a while without medical treatment. So you put them aside. And what you focus on is that middle range of patients who can be most helped by the resources limited resources that you have. And you don't try to give them perfect care. You give them just good enough care that you save them and can move on to the next patient. And you're playing a game of numbers here. Maybe you save them, maybe you don't. You're just trying to increase their odds. But when you're in triage situation, you have no choice. You have to make do with the resources you have. And that's rapidly approaching with the COVID-19 thing, that we're going to be in situations here where we don't have enough ventilators. We don't have enough facilities, doctors, everything to treat everybody. So somebody at some point has to make some triage decisions about who gets treated. But from the hospital standpoint, it doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen in Beth Israel, because Beth Israel, like every other hospital in the country, is focused on best practices and giving the patient everything that they need without any compromises. It's essentially unsustainable. In an epidemic like this, it's unsustainable, but there is this firewall between the hospital and the outside world. The outside world might have to deal with triage, but the hospital itself doesn't. The hospital is always, once you get into the hospital, you're guaranteed optimal care within the resources that they have. They might still not have enough ventilators, but they're going to do everything in their power to eliminate risks and give you everything you can to survive. Best practices is also essentially the philosophy behind all of these lockdowns. So when New York State or Massachusetts tells all of their citizens to go home and don't interact with anybody and keep a 10-foot distance or 6-foot distance between all people, and they're really practicing this sort of perfect medicine where they're trying to eliminate any kind of risk whatsoever. And I think the silliest example of that is closing the beaches in Massachusetts and elsewhere. The place you're least likely to catch a disease would be a beach, because there's all this huge distance between you and your fellow beachgoer that there's virtually no chance of catching it. But it falls under this blanket thing. This is basically lockdowns are basically a sledgehammer approach where we're going to eliminate every possible source of infection, no matter how unlikely. And like best practices elsewhere, the only problem is that it is frightfully expensive to do this. And the horrible expense here is that by locking down everything and shutting down the economy, you are destroying people's livelihoods. You are assuring a massive depression that's going to cause a lot more human misery than the virus itself. So the virus itself will be under control by the end of 2020. The Great Depression, the huge economic collapse, is going to go on for years and decades. And it's going to be made all the worse by the fact that these municipalities and states and countries impose these draconian lockdown rules instead of addressing the things that really matter. So in my last podcast, I talked about the difference between Japan and Italy. Japan has only, less than 100 deaths, even though it has twice the population of Italy and was exposed much earlier than Italy. Italy has tens of thousands of deaths. So what gives here? What's the difference? And it's very simple. They have different vectors, different disease vectors. In Japan, when you greet someone, you bow. There's never any contact between strangers. In Italy, you shake hands, you embrace. There's a lot of contact. This is a high contact culture. So yes, how Italy is responding is lock everything down, lock everybody in their room, shut down transportation, shut down everything. But the real solution is to make Italians behave more like Japanese, which is cut out the handshaking, control the obvious vectors like doorknobs and places that will transfer disease. And if you can get down to that kind of more subtle manipulation of vectors, then you can reopen your economy and you continue to do things. Unfortunately, the lockdowns have already had their effect. They're already devastating the economy. And I think we'll have to deal with those effects for years, if not decades to come. So philosophically, the long-term solution to the coronavirus crisis is shifting gears to the triage model, both in the medical system and in outside life. You don't need to eliminate every conceivable vector of transmission. You only need to attack the big things, the main things that are transferring the virus, the handshaking, the doorknobs, the things where we're obviously a lot of people are touching, and worry about those things. If you can beat down those things, then you're going to reduce the transmission to the point where it's no longer self-sustainable and the thing will peter out. The only trouble is the world just hasn't clued into that. Governments haven't clued into that. Governments love lockdowns because it proves that they're doing something. And it's going to take a few weeks or a few months before the world figure out this is not a good thing. It's not a good thing to shut down the economy because you'll never get it running again. And you don't have to eliminate every single risk. You just have to eliminate the most prominent risks, the most prominent vectors. And otherwise, you need to get along and continue with life and get back to having a real economy.